Look at the Indians. Look at what they're doing. They're so successful. Half of the tech founder or CEOs are all Indian. There is this pressure then that gets put on as being Indian. But we know that that's not the full story.
And I think that plays into the stereotype that all South Asians are like that. All South Asians are so smart. I remember my guidance counselor saying to me in high school when I had asked to move into another class or change my schedule, he said, "Oh, you people are so competitive." And he was a Black man who said this to me. I'll never forget it. And I remember feeling as a 16-year-old, a 14-year-old, something feels odd about this. Something feels cringy about that statement. And when I unpack it later, I realized right there was an example of how these groups have been pinned against each other. And the stereotype has really become internalized.
If you're dating, it should be within your culture. First, it starts with you have to date the same culture, subculture as you. Then they open up to okay, anyone Indian is fine.
Yeah.
And then it's okay, fine. They might accept a white person, but what is the two rules as a Hindu Indian? They'll say no blacks, no Muslims. And, for the other side, they say the same thing, right? No Hindus, no black.
I think the South Asian community would benefit from self-reflection, education, awareness, and doing the work, right? And that can feel like a lot, but it can also happen in small moments. It doesn't have to be all at once. But I think just that capacity to do that opens doors for other communities, opens chances for us to connect with other humans that we don't get to connect with usually.
Behind every opinion, every conflict, and every moment of courage, there is a human story longing to be understood. I'm Dr. Payal Beri, and this is Reframing Perspectives, a space for conversations that help us see ourselves and each other with more honesty and curiosity so that we can build empathy and compassion in our world. Here in these episodes, we're going to explore the layers of what it means to be human in leadership, in society, and in our everyday lives, and how by understanding those layers, it can reshape our relationships, our communities, and our impact. So let's step inside and let's begin. When we talk about South Asians, we tend to picture a certain kind of success story, one shaped by education, privilege, and the economic mobility. And although that's a true story, it's not the full story. It's a myth that's built on selective visibility. And my guest today, Dr. Shanta, is a psychologist and social impact advocate who spent her career helping brown communities heal and thrive. She grew up within the community, witnessing both the strength and the struggle of belonging to a group often labeled as the model minority. But as she'll tell you, that label hides far more than it reveals. In this conversation, we dig into the history and the complexity of South Asian identity, the privilege that exists within it, and the stories we've erased along the way. We're going to explore the history of Caribbean Indians, African Indians, working class immigrants who've often been left out of the South Asian narrative, and how lumping this diverse community into one successful category actually deepens inequity in the conversations about immigration, belonging, and opportunity. Because if we want to build empathy and understanding across communities, we have to start by telling the truth, especially the ones that we've edited out. So I hope you join me in listening to this beautiful conversation with Dr. Shanta. Shanta, I'm so happy to have you here, and I can't wait to dive into everything that you have committed your profession and career to about helping South Asians in understanding their emotional response, their emotional expression, and South Asian, how we express mental health, how we experience our own dynamics, whether it's, especially here in the US and coming as immigrants, there's so much that we carry on with ourselves. But today we're going to dive into a little bit of a different take on all of this and recognizing the path that South Asians are considered to be statistically the wealthiest community in the minority communities. We're a small percentage. I think we're only about 1.6 or 2% of the population of the US. Mm-hmm. So it's not a really big population, but we carry majority wealth. Mm-hmm. And so with that association of carrying majority wealth, we then get seen in a specific way, the model minority. Look at the Indians. Look at what they're doing. They're so successful. Half of the tech founder or CEOs are all Indian. There is this pressure then that gets put on as being Indian. But we know that that's not the full story. That is not the full context. And there's so many more layers to this and who gets included, who gets excluded from this. So I can't wait to dig into all of that with you.
Me too. Thank you so much for having me. So excited to be here.
Yeah. So I want to start with just addressing it with what it is. The model minority myth and this notion of what it means to be called a model minority. How do you see this getting played out within the culture, within our South Asian space, and in relationship to those who are then experiencing South Asians?
I think this myth, like we've talked about before, is something that a lot of our parents, when they immigrated here, may not have understood how it impacted them or how they played into it, right? But the reality is that for the most part, this isn't for everyone, but for the most part, the people who immigrated in the 70s were people who were educated, English-speaking, were closer to whiteness in their home country of India. And so who came here, right, does not reflect the entire South Asian diaspora. Right? We have a specific percentage of that we see who show up on TV shows, on the news, in books and articles as professors, right? And I think that plays into the stereotype that all South Asians are like that. All South Asians are so smart. I remember my guidance counselor saying to me in high school when I had asked to move into another class or change my schedule, he said, "Oh, you people are so competitive." And he was a Black man who said this to me. I'll never forget it. And I remember feeling as a 16-year-old, a 14-year-old, something feels odd about this. Something feels cringy about that statement. And when I unpack it later, I realized right there was an example of how these groups have been pinned against each other. And the stereotype has really become internalized and become a part of the culture here that South Asians are the ones who are trying to get ahead, are really smart, trying to advance, and that there's no stopping them, right? Because we're just born like that. But we know that isn't the case. We know there are so many others whose voices we don't get to hear. We don't get to see them represented out there in the media. And so I think this myth is one that we've benefited from in some ways, but absolutely creates more divisions and really pins us against other minority groups who need solidarity and community to be seen for who they are.
That's so interesting to think about it as and you're absolutely right. There's a community that came over that could afford to come over, right? That's one piece. But there are also other South Asians that came over because, they did it with a scholarship. They did it with, so it isn't only those who have had money and could come over. I know my parents had to work really hard to be able to come over. They're not engineers. They're not doctors. They're not lawyers. Mm-hmm. And so we don't fall into that bucket of what is considered South Asian, of success of they're all this. And there's this pressure. Did you ever, growing up, feel this internalized pressure that you should show up in one of these career buckets in order to preserve the image of, our families, we've made it success bucket?
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes it was explicit and sometimes, usually actually, it was implicit, right? There's just this understanding that if we're here in this country, if we're being educated here in one of the top nations for education, that we should make use of it, not squander it, appreciate it, and do the best we can with it so that the immigration journey was worth it. Again, no one ever said this to me, but looking around, I grew up in a majority South Asian or predominantly South Asian community, and just looking around at the other families and my friends and the people before me in high school or in college where they were going, right? There were just certain paths that were talked about and applauded and rewarded. And so there's this message that you kind of have to flow in that same way to follow in other people's footsteps and to create the sense of pride and receive the rewards, even the little dopamine hits of, yes, I got praise. Yes, I won that. Or they were so proud of me. It feels good. So we keep doing it.
Yeah. I was never someone who was good at math and science. It was never an area. So I became psychologist, right? To that point, there's this, and when I believe, in the early 2000s, when we are going into those career paths, being a psychologist was still a relatively new foreign concept for South Asian parents of what is this thing that you're trying to be and do? But again, if we go to the relationship of, when we say South Asian, to the external, so not to the South Asians themselves, but to the external group, who actually gets seen and who gets left out of that definition?
Mm-hmm. And who we see right now are people, like we said, right, who were educated in Ivy League institutions, who maybe have the capital to have their own, maybe be in shows or be directors, right? Who have found ways to make it in their specific disciplines. And it's not for everyone, but usually, again, like you said, it's not, some people came here without much, but some had access in where they came from in their families, or had a legacy, or had the chance to go to top schools here so that they could be in positions of power here. But the people we don't see, right, are the people who come here as refugees, the people who come here because they received scholarships and they made it out of their very poor families, perhaps, and took the opportunity to come here, and they send money back to their families. It may be the first people to make it through high school, let alone college or graduate school, right? We don't see those represented in media. A little bit more with time, which has been cool to see, but it's not the stereotype and the predominant portrayal that we see.
Yeah.
Right?
I think also something that's really interesting with South Asians is that there's this false belief as well about how South Asian families are perfect and their parents are so happy, and, you know, we don't have the same dysfunctions that other cultures have, and, you know, we don't get divorced and we don't have those things, right? That was really big in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s growing up here. And you hear this as well as, you know, the idea notion of domestic violence, for example, like that is like, no. And so there's this like immediate shock that people have, like, what? Like there was domestic violence? Like, you know, what? Like that can't happen. We're Indian, right? And so even that piece that I can imagine that families and individuals who grew up in that kind of an environment who feel now even a next layer of shame or being excluded in terms of, you know, I don't represent that South Asian picture perfect, you know, expectation that we have of them.
Right. Who is perfect? To be human is to be imperfect, right? This idea that we have to look a certain way and be in a certain way, that's created socially, right? That's a social construct or maybe an ideal that we hope for so that we feel safe or we feel soothed by the idea that things are okay in our community, right? I still remember, I tell this story often because it still really sticks with me in my memory. When I shared with someone in my community, an uncle in the community, what my undergrad thesis was on. I was at Rutgers of doing an honors program, and there was a thesis required, and I was looking at how substance abuse treatment could be made more culturally appropriate and culturally sensitive. And at the time, there wasn't much research going on in the South Asian community. And so I was curious about the African American community and what was lacking rather in the treatment provided to see if there were ways in which it could be made more robust and more effective and more personalized to that population. And I said to this uncle, like, I hope I can do that one day for our community. And he was like, substance abuse in our community? Come on. And I'm thinking, oh man, if he went to a club in New York City where I, you know, used to go with friends or go to any of the bars in New York where I would go to celebrate birthdays or whatever. That is not the case, uncle. That is not the case, right? And it just showed how removed, you know, he was with, you know, the next generation or even his peers, and how he'd only seen certain portions of families.
But do you think there's also a sense of denial there? Because obviously, if you look at, you know, things that are happening currently in India with Punjab and the way that, you know, drugs are being infiltrated in, and the younger generation is really, there's an opioid crisis. There's so much happening there. But even here in the US, you know, or you look at like how alcohol is like a celebrated part of culture, and you don't look at that alcohol is actually a substance abuse form as well. Do you think that there's a form of just deep denial about this because of this preservation of assimilation that they want to have?
Absolutely. I think to be seen as perfect, whatever you want to call that, to be seen as accepted and doing well, and to see one has to be close to success or close to perfection or be seen as close to whiteness, right? Because not that the white community doesn't have substance abuse, but I think there's this belief that like the good Americans and the good culture, right? If we're closer to that, then we will be okay. And I think when people left their countries of origin, let's say India, I think too there was perhaps an idealization that happened when they came here. The country that they left behind, what they saw at that time is kind of what they remember it to be like, right? But
they're frozen in time.
they're frozen in time. And so they can't believe there could be things happening. And they often will find ways to rationalize that. Oh, it must be just that population with India. It might be just that community in India. Oh, it must be because they're not educated and they're poor. A lot of rationalizations to make it make sense, right? Because if you go into the nitty-gritty of each family dynamic, each community, there's a lot to unpack, which might be way too much to process if you don't have the tools to do that.
And how much do you think that there's this internalized, I don't know if it's internalized hate or internalized shame, but there's something going on that, because everything like those words that you're using, those like, oh, they must be poor and they must be uneducated or they must be this, those assumptions that are being made, right? Or there is some level of, I need to distance myself from that because I have worked too hard to get to where I'm at and to ruin and taint the reputation and image of my family. And part of that family is the pride that I carry in my culture.
Mm-hmm. I think, too, there's difficulty holding two truths at the same time, right? That my family can be fantastic. My father can be such a hard worker and loving man and have a substance abuse problem, for example. Or my mom might work really hard and love me, but might have struggled with postpartum depression, right? Or that auntie in my house, my family, my masi, whoever, right? Like she's so nice and so sweet and teaches me so much, but she might be struggling with psychosis, right? To hold these two truths at once makes the picture seem a little murkier and more confusing to process. But that is a reality, right? We're made up of many parts and we are not just one thing.
Yeah, and there's so much secrecy in that. And I wonder how much of that secrecy then is holding us back as a community to really thrive together and support each other, be there for each other, because there's this need of external validation from colonization has obviously influenced this and the dynamic of that. The closer we are to, as you were talking about a little bit earlier about the white adjacency, the more successful we are. And that obviously stems from the history of colonization, where speaking of holding two truths, like South Asians can hate the Brits and yet at the same time want to be so deeply validated by the value system that the Brits have left within South Asia, South Asian cultures.
Yes. Yes, we have this narrative, right? Like we gained independence, they needed to go, we had to fight them. While that's true, colonized peoples were incentivized or coerced to adapt language, dress, religion, behaviors to gain access, protection, or social mobility, right? So there's no way that people were not impacted by that in some shape or form, right? There was a long-standing pattern that was created. You align with whiteness as survival or for advancement, that's great, but in turn, you might have to devalue your own cultural practices and community knowledge, right? And so I think you see that show up here in the U.S. context or in an immigration context by maybe downplaying some of the issues within our homes, within our communities, and really showing the quote-unquote best parts of ourselves, right? And we show the parts of ourselves that have adopted majority culture, because then we are elite, because then we are refined. And then we can show up on TV screens and be welcomed with open arms as long as we look and act a certain way, right?
Yeah. I mean, and what that really brings up is that idea, again, that if we take it back to as immigrants coming into this country, trying to make it, become successful, settle here, I mean, that's a whole level of another just change and what it requires of someone to be able to do that, no matter where you've immigrated from. And one element of that is that you may know the history because you learned it in your schools about the history of your, origin country, but you don't necessarily know the history of the country that you're coming into. So then in order to be successful and survival and make it and all this, what are you doing? You're basing your decisions off of where to live, who to spend time with, based off of the cultural sound bites. And through what the media is saying and through community, like, hey, what's a safe neighborhood to live in? Hey, what's a best school district to go to. How do I do this piece? And everything is layering it then with you understanding like, oh, okay, don't hang out with that demographic. Don't go to that neighborhood because it's filled with like unsafe people. And so now your knowledge of where you have to do and what you have to do to survive is tainted from the biases of, racial challenges, issues, all of these like nuances and complexities that come in. And I say this often with the idea that South Asians come here a good amount, become very successful, but fail to recognize that their success is on the backs of other communities that are consistently fighting for the basic things that they're able to benefit off of, but they don't connect the dots often. So what would you say in terms of South Asians who can look at their success, be happy about their success, and hold space and recognize that they were only able to achieve this success and be in this country because of being, of the backs of these other marginalized communities?
I think this is something that isn't talked about in our history books. It's not talked about in our classes. And that's part of the issue too, right? I was educated in the US for the most part, and this was not discussed. This piece of it was not discussed, right? There was so much that we didn't learn about. And so we have a very particular way of thinking about the world and thinking about America. And I think there was some incentive to not talk about it, right? Because they didn't want people up and rallying and recognizing what was happening, right? Again, whether it was consciously or unconsciously, that's what it was. But yes, I think the model minority stereotype, it fuels anti-Blackness, anti-immigrant sentiment, because it suggests that proximity to whiteness equals worthiness, right? And it claims that, if you could do it, if this Asian American group can do it, if they can succeed, that means it's possible. That's what's implied. It's possible. So the ones who aren't doing it, who can't get the same sort of success, they're just being lazy, or they're just complaining about nothing, or they're just creating excuses, or they're just involved with drugs. That's why they can't do better, right? But it does not talk about and acknowledge the completely different histories, completely different stories and legacies that each of these groups experiences, right? I mean, there's this fear of darkness, too. If you think about dark-skinned complexion, even way back in India.
I mean, they have bleach cosmetics to bleach your face.
Still there.
Still there.
Years, fair and lovely, just kicking it, still doing their thing.
Yep.
Right? And it's not banned. It's like kind of chuckled about, but it's still used, right? I was showing my kids a Bollywood song the other day. I was like, let me see what's popular. For Diwali, let's see what's going on in the Bollywood world. And my 10-year-old recognized, she was like, everyone kind of looks alike. And everyone seems to be the same color. My 5-year-old's like, yeah, and everyone's wearing a bra. Is that like traditional? I was like, no, it's not. I mean, so many things to unpack here, sexuality and colorism, right? But I think that story also carries over. Colorism carries over here, like you were saying about the neighborhoods and the schools, right? What do they learn? People learn here. Oh, the good neighborhoods are where the white people are. The dangerous, bad neighborhoods are where the Black people are. So we better stay away from that so we can stay safe.
Right. I mean, even, if we think about the way that, and I've seen comedians start to make jokes about it as well to kind of call it out. But when we talk about even in the US, South Asians with, growing up in home, right? Your parents start telling you, first of all, you're not allowed to start dating until you're much older. And then if you're dating, it should be within your culture. First, it starts with you have to date the same subculture as you. Then they open up to like, okay, anyone Indian is fine.
Yeah.
And then it's like, okay, fine. They might accept a white person. But what is the two rules as a Hindu? Indian, they'll say no Blacks, no Muslims. And, for the other side, they say the same thing, right? No Hindus, no Blacks. But it's like there is this piece that gets stuck in. And so, I now consciously, when I hear some of my friends speak, and whenever they say, I'm just going to start dating someone, like non-Indian, what they really mean is white, because they have so ingrained it, even if they don't think consciously that they are acting differently, but they themselves just find themselves like, I just can't find myself to be attracted to a Black person. It's like, well, because think about why. Because of all of those deep, like ingrained belief systems that were put in, right? And same thing, like, oh, I don't find this. And there's some layer to like, you just aren't attracted to, maybe someone or whatever. That's fine. But those layers are layered in because of that white adjacency that we have.
Yes.
And what has been done, and I would love to hear your perspective on this, is that we look at the brown community. And what I feel like has been done so strategically is that brown people have been used literally as a chess piece in order to create division between people of color, so that there is always this thing of layers of hierarchy of hate.
Yes. And when we chase proximity to whiteness in that hierarchy, we do gain temporary safety, but we lose collective power.
I feel like we're seeing this now with Vivek Ramaswamy. We're seeing this with Dinesh D'Souza, all of these individuals who are coming out in political places. And with everything that's happening right now, they are facing, I don't know how many times Vivek Ramaswamy has to have racism being like just slurred at his face for him to finally get it. But there is this piece of, I have to keep trying to be on this side. We have people like Nikki Haley who, refuse to acknowledge, maybe they do it in private, but they know to play the political game. They cannot embrace or embody who they are as a South Asian. And what does that say about us as a community? What does that say about, again, that idea of survivor mode, scarcity mode, that keep your head down, don't ruffle the feathers. You're also trying to make it here.
I don't know what's going on with Isha Vance.
Oh God, please don't go there. I can't. I physically cannot.
As you were talking, I was feeling my stomach tighten. I don't know. I wish I could find out what the story was there with Vivek Ramaswamy too, right? When he's getting these terrible things being thrown at him, said to him. I'm so curious. He keeps a good poker face, but I really want to know how that feels in his body. Does he feel safe in those rooms, right? What does he actually believe? Does he believe what he's saying? It's hard to pick it apart. It is. And I think what's hard is we're not able to really have those conversations too, because they're so upsetting when we do hear from people who have internalized racism and have such internalized hatred for their own, right? And refuse to look at the backs they're standing on. And so we never get to really unpack it, with the other side because it's so painful.
Hi, friends. I have a favor to ask you. If you're enjoying these episodes, then I'd really love it if you could subscribe, leave a review, or share it with your friends and family. Your words help others discover that the stories and these episodes exist in the perspectives that we're exploring over here. And the more that we can grow, the more feedback that we get from you through those reviews, the more we can make sure that we're creating meaningful episodes that you want to listen to. You have no idea how much this helps and how much I appreciate you for doing this. So if you don't mind, whether it's following us, subscribing, hitting the button below, if you can leave a review for us, or if you just share this with your friends and family, the episodes that you think that they would really resonate with, it means more to us than you can imagine. Thank you so much. I do think the younger generations are doing a much better job at being more aware and being more open to understanding. And maybe it is, this piece of the more you are removed from the immigration generation and you are here, the more you are able to understand how to show up in the society, being able to hold both sides versus I think of, my parents immigrated here. I came here when I was 10 years old. I didn't come from India. I came, lived in the Middle East. So there's even that other third culture layer to me that is disconnected. But when I look at, my nieces and who are born and raised here, they've actually never visited India, so they don't know. They are very culturally attuned, very differently. My older niece loves, she wants to read the Mahabharata, she wants to learn the Ramayana, she celebrates Diwali, she loves the culture, the history, she wants to understand it. She hates dancing and like Indian dancing, and she doesn't watch Bollywood movies. She refuses that part. But my younger niece is all about, she's seen every Bollywood movie. She loves Bollywood dancing. She's more into like all the glitz and glamour and the fun and the festivals and all those pieces, and a little bit less on the, let me understand the historical notions of those things, right? But they're both very well aware and proud of the Indian heritage that they have. They show up differently with it, but yet they're also able to hold space for the fact that they're just growing up in a very diverse school. They're growing up in a very diverse space, and they're very open and receptive to experiencing what it means to be an American who is Indian who's American, and also that, we have this, I live a really good life and I'm very lucky. But what do you think it is in terms of for us as a community? We've got, just like anywhere else, there's hierarchy of socioeconomic groups, there's hierarchy of elitism, there's hierarchy of, we touched a little bit about it, but I want to dive into the other layers of those who've come from the West Indies, the ones who've come from the Caribbean, the ones who've come from Africa, which people don't realize, the Indians that came from the West Indies, a lot of them came because they were in a slave trade when they first got to the Caribbean. They weren't there because they were affluent doctors. And so when they come here, and you see this a lot, of course, some of my clients when I was doing home-based therapy in New York, and it was an awakening for me because I grew up in this bubble of what it meant to be South Asian. But then one of my clients is a West Indies Indian where she's a maid and her husband's driving cabs, and their kid feels this level of, why I do not belong to that type of Indian. Why am I part of this kind of Indian? And you're seeing this dynamic of grief, guilt, shame. Parents are feeling sad, like they failed their son, but at the same time, they're doing whatever they can to just give him the best of his life. And he recognizes that, but then he's 14, so he's trying to assimilate. How can we as a South Asian community create space to be more accepting and open to the different layers of what it means to be South Asian within our own community?
I have so many thoughts. I want to go back to that point. If we can go back to that point too about this generation, I'd love to go back to that. I had a thought around it, especially because I live in Chicago and I just was in my kids' school in our neighborhood last week, right? So I have a lot of thoughts about what came up from that, but put a pin on that. So the question was, how do we kind of grapple with, or
how do we create more acceptance within our own South Asian community to broaden the definition of what it means to be South Asian within our own community? Because I do think it starts with our community before we can expand that idea to everyone else.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, education. And after that, dropping our defensiveness, right? So I don't think many of us were raised knowing about the history of folks who were sent to the West Indies, right? Or had to immigrate to Africa from India. We have not learned that in the textbooks. And I don't think many of our parents share that with us either because, again, so many things to learn in this new country, that wasn't top priority. But I think there is a lack of understanding of who these people are that might share skin color, but might have names that are a little different than ours, but kind of close to it, or have a different accent or different foods, but it's similar to the food we eat. There isn't a lot of understanding around who they are, why they're here, and how they came here, right? So I think being open to learning and asking questions and being curious about people outside of who we know and how we know them is going to be really important to then understanding what other groups' needs are, right? And ensuring then that they are given a voice in places where they're not allowed to speak, or they're invited to the table where decisions are being made, right? I don't know if we do a good job of that because we may not be in those same spaces. We might be in a cab in New York City, notice it, and then move on, right? And then I think when we comes to then doing something about it, we have to not feel like this is about a blame game. Like they're in this position because you are so elite, or, you didn't know anything. And that's why, they're, stuck in situations where they don't get to move ahead and have social mobility the way you do. It's not about blame. It's really about awareness and accountability, right? Because if we don't do that, then we're not going to be open to with curiosity and compassion. We're just going to sit in our echo chambers and know what we know and pass that down to our kids then too. That's where I worry about the next generation, is that you have to have communities and people willing to expose them to different things out there, different types of people, because we can certainly stay in the same neighborhood and see the same types of brown people in my neighborhood, right? The same types of family structures or jobs, right? So you might have to drive 20 minutes to Devon for my kids to see brown people who are wait staff, kitchen staff, chefs, different accents, different smells. It's not the one-off person over there in our neighborhood that's also South Asian and we're like, oh, hey, what's up?
Right. I think that is really powerful. Is like expanding that horizon and not looking at it as anything, because we're 1.2 billion people in India. Do you think every single person there is a doctor, lawyer, engineer? No, we have a very strong, entertainment industry there. We have a very large population lives in poverty and, are doing the work of servants and maids. I mean, every middle class family up has servants and maids that come to their homes and clean and do the laundry and do everything. That's just like a common part of it. And so to think and deny that exists and that those people exist within our community here is, it's refusing a part of just understanding that we are humans and we belong to a culture that also has different vocations and different skill sets and all of this, but being accepting of the fact that we all come from this origin space and we're all trying to just make it here and exist. But you said you wanted to touch back on that earlier point about the generations.
Yeah, I think we sort of brought it up here too, that I think unless we do our work, our kids aren't going to know what else is out there and other ways of thinking, right? And something I think my family's talked a lot about recently in age-appropriate ways, and something I've been thinking about is how the illusion of safety in whiteness always comes with a cost. And it can be taken away as quickly as it's given. Yeah. So my kids are walking to school, and my daughter is asking me why the helicopters are there above our school, and why people are like congregated around the school corners. There were about 100 parents congregated on Friday, all coming to show solidarity for our school because ICE was in our neighborhood picking up people in corners in front of like my nail shop, in front of a restaurant I was at just the night before, pinning people down. And the kids could feel it. They're like, why are there so many parents here at every corner? There were parents at every corner there to make sure kids were getting home safely, right? And my daughter the next day said, but how will they know that I was born here? And wait, were you born here? Wait, were our grandparents born here? Are they going to be safe? Because my brown looks like my friend's brown and she's Latina. So wait, I'm so confused. Who are they going to take away? Who should we be scared of? And the reality is, I don't care, if you were born here or if you have a passport here, right? But I don't think people are really thinking through that when they're picking people up.
Yeah.
Right? It's just this belief that because we are here, we're safe became false so quickly.
Right.
Right. It was taken away immediately. And once it became visible, our differences, right? Or that was put back into prominence, that safety that we believe we had is not there. And luckily, my neighborhood has this capacity to do that. Parents were able to work from home and walk around and patrol around the school all day. And they were sending text messages about where ICE was every hour. We're monitoring where they were. But the lady selling popsicles and chips outside of our school, we asked her if we could buy stuff, the day's worth of stuff, or buy things from her carton so she could go home because she may not be as safe, right? And I think this has been a terrifying time for people in Chicago, but I've got to say the sense of solidarity that people have been showing in my specific neighborhood and across many neighborhoods in Chicago has been quite beautiful. Like, it didn't matter what kind of brown, it didn't matter, what your status was. There was just a showing up and taking care of one another. And that's what I want the next generation to see, that no matter what, that's still important. Don't feel so safe that you could just kick back and be white adjacent, because there's still a need for solidarity no matter what.
Yeah. I want to ask you this final question, which I feel like so much of what we've talked about has already answered it. But if you could reframe one thing about how South Asians can use their success and their platform to create inclusiveness for our own community, and then through that, inclusive of recognizing the privilege that we have because of other communities that have been continuously fighting for their own rights, what would that reframe be for the South Asian community?
Mm-hmm. I think the South Asian community would benefit from self-reflection, education, awareness, and doing the work, right? And that can feel like a lot, but it can also happen in small moments. It doesn't have to be all at once. But I think just that capacity to do that opens doors for other communities, opens chances for us to connect with other humans that we don't get to connect with usually. And I think it sort of removes us from these cliques and these specific groups that we feel like we have to stick to for safety, and allows us to move away from the scarcity mindset that we have to get all the resources for ourselves or else, right? And can move us into collective liberation and collective thriving.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing this. I think you left it at a place where I wish we could go deeper in, but we'll have to bring you back for more, because what you're just sharing is, I think that we're so used to, especially with media, constantly seeing the worst of humanity, because that's how they make their dollars and that's how they win. But you sharing how everyone in your community came together for the schools, I think shows the best of humanity. And I do think that there is more of that happening in our world than not, but we are just not exposed to it because our social media platforms and media don't benefit from showing us that. And so we continue to live in this fear that perpetuates this idea of, oh, just keep quiet, keep silent, keep all this stuff, which I've said to you offline that I have a bit of that, definite comes up for me as well, of just this nervousness of like, what is the extent that I can do? But there's always that idea of like, do what you can feel safe doing. Don't not do anything.
Right. Right. And even if you are in your safe bubble, right? I've messaged, people, and it's not their fault at all, friends, family. What I'm witnessing here is so different from what they're witnessing. Yeah. And so their algorithms, their conversations, our text change with moms in their parent thread, right? They're just different. And that's okay. But I think we have to make sure we stretch ourselves a little bit and catch our own stereotypes in, right? Because then I have people saying, wait, so is Chicago like really unsafe now? I'm like, well, because of ICE, but I mean, it's not, I still feel safe. We're still safe. It's still safe. Let's let these stereotypes also get checked, right? And get understood. And when we're talking about it with our peers, let's be aware of it too. What we're avoiding talking about, what we're avoiding watching and thinking about, because it's unpleasant.
Yeah. Where can everyone find you to hear more about your perspective on your thoughts, your resources? How can they connect with you?
Thanks for asking. So I'm on Instagram at SNK_therapy. So my initials, SNK_therapy. I also have a website, SNKtherapy.com, where people can look at offerings I have outside of the individual therapy that I do. I do workshops for corporate spaces. I do educational workshops for organizations too, on a variety of topics. I have a group for women who want to move from surviving to thriving. So would love to hear from folks, hear comments, hear feedback, and build community in that way too.
Wonderful. We'll have everything in the links and description, everything for people to be able to reach out to you. But thank you so much for being here. These are such important conversations. And we really hope that whoever's listening, regardless if you're South Asian or not South Asian, I think that this conversation isn't necessarily something specific to South Asians. I think this is something that every group can be thinking about within their own community of how are we taking on white adjacency? How are we taking on our own culture? How are we denying parts of our culture? How are we not being inclusive, exclusive because of our own relationship to our own wounds and traumas and experiences within our community? So I really think that this conversation, although we focused on the South Asian, I think this can be really applied across the board.
Yes. Oh, and I want to put a plug. If you're in the Chicago area, we do have, I'm on a leadership team for the South Asian Solidarity Movement. And we had an event just last week on white adjacency, and people said, well, can I come if I'm white? And I thought it was incredible that we had so many Black elders from Chicago. We had white folks. That's a type of space that I hope we can create across the country where people are curious and have humility and can talk across groups to see what each group is experiencing at this time.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you so much. I can't wait to have you back again.
Thank you.